Well, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much, David, for that welcome, and I hope you've all been having a wonderful time at the conference. The Premier, Jay Weatherall, asked me to...
Need to make the mic up a bit more.
Sorry.
Are you there? Okay. Anyway, the Premier, Jay Weatherall, asked me to say to those of you who are coming from interstate to please enjoy yourself as much as possible in South Australia, to see as much as possible, and the Treasurer, Tom Coutson-Tone, has asked me to say please spend as much as you can while you're here. I also bring greetings from the Mayor of Unley. You're in the city of Unley, Lachlan Klein. He sends his greetings to you all tonight, and he's an active person in the Christian community. Now, my topic tonight is untying the donkey of mission. I want to take as my theme the Bible verse, part of Matthew 21, verse 2, a very small part of that verse. In particular, the words of Jesus, "Untie them and bring them to me." Now, I'm addressing a mission conference. You may think that's untying people from the ties of the world and bring them to Jesus. In fact, verse 2 of Matthew 21 refers to a donkey and her colt. The verse refers to Jesus' instruction to his disciples to bring a donkey and her colt to him. As we know, that then leads to the coming back to Jerusalem. The principal significance of the verse is its connection to the fulfillment of prophecy, that the donkey will be carrying Jesus into Jerusalem in the lead up to his crucifixion and then to his resurrection. But the wonderful power of the living word is that we call the Bible is that text can have layers of meaning, additional meanings beside their primary purpose. They can be multivalent in their meanings. It may seem surprising that these 7 words that I have quoted from part of Matthew 21 may have an additional layer of meaning. Untie the donkey and her colt and bring them to me. But Valsan Tampu, a wonderful Christian thinker from India, argues so in his book, Be Thou My Vision, Spiritual Resources for a Healing Ministry. He writes, before it was incorporated into the salvation story, the scope of the donkey's life world was lamentably circumscribed. The rope by which it was tied defined the range of its freedom and the scope of its possibilities. The untying of the donkey is an appropriate parallel to the implication of self-denial in the human context. If the donkey were to be untied only to be at large without any role in the journey to Jerusalem, it would stand to lose rather than to gain. It will lose its familiar world without gaining anything in exchange for it. Self-denial in the biblical sense, on the other hand, signifies the freedom for and the freedom in discipleship which makes the fullness of life possible. That's Valsan Tampu. So it is not just the theme of untying that I wish to explore in the context of mission, but the tying to something as well. Before we even reflect on mission, just the question of life at large in this temporal reality shows what is at stake. It is the nature of us human beings not only to be social beings, but also to seek comfort in our social networks. We seek social moorings. We seek to be tied to the world like the donkey was to her surroundings. For us as believers, the moorings are our faith. But even secularists, non-believers, have sought such moorings. The rationalist proposition is as much an attempt to explain the world in a desire for known and reassuring moorings as anything. It is what makes the postmodern context so difficult. The moorings have been loosed, and like the donkey, we are at risk of finding ourselves at large without any role. The challenges for believers in this context have similarities, but also differences to the challenges for non-believers. But there may be remarkable similarity in the way in which both groups seek to respond to the challenges. And I want to look at some areas to which we seek to respond to challenges in the context of mission. I want particularly, for example, to explore the pull of the utilitarian away from the precious and the attractiveness of the reactive at the sake of the prophetic. And I want to look at both in the context of Jesus' two great commands: to love the Lord your God with all your heart and to love our neighbours as ourselves. Let's first look at utilitarianism. I want to share two stories from my time in World Vision, in particular my time when I was regional, and it's great to see John Roxburgh here from New Zealand. We had some wonderful times together when World Vision Australia and World Vision New Zealand were doing some great collaboration together, so good to see you, John. When I was based in Asia as regional vice president for World Vision, one of the great privileges indeed, was to be able to go around and see some wonderful work with street children in different parts of the region. And I would extol the virtues of this. And one of the communities where I went was Dhaka, the slums of Dhaka. Now, I don't know if you've had the chance to go to Dhaka, but the slums of Dhaka are as intense a set of slums as you will see anywhere. And in these, this one particular slum where I had the privilege to go on a couple of occasions, I met Mildred. Mildred, who is from Bangladesh, not a very Bangladeshi name, but she is Bangladeshi. She worked in a slum where the police did not like to go. The death rate ran in the number of murders per day. It was too dangerous a site for the police to go into. But Mildred would go in 7 days a week into this community, and amongst the other things she did was to be there for street children. They would come in the morning and she would offer them buckets of water, some food to wash with, some food to eat, and then give them some time to be the children that they were. And when I asked her, well, what happens then? She said, well, I haven't got enough money to keep looking after these children. They are going to have to leave, and they are going to have to go out and survive until the next morning. And they are going to do things that you are going to be appalled by. They're going to do things that you're going to find shameful, disgraceful. They're going to commit criminal acts. They're certainly going to be violent. But I tell you this much. Tomorrow morning, when they come back, I will be here with buckets of water for them to wash, with food for them to eat, and I will give them some time to be the children that they are before they have to go back onto the street to face the task of surviving to the next day. Now that was a wonderful message, and I thought that embodied to my mind the spirit of Jesus, let the children come to me, rather than the disciples who had taken a utilitarian viewpoint that they were a nuisance, sent them away. I was to see a mirror image of that, and a mirror image is not a nice image. When I met a church leader in a country within the region, who was from that country within the region, and when being told about the wonderful things of the street children programs, he said, why would you water weeds? Why would you water weeds? Now, apart from the fact that I think the theology of that is an abomination, that he would make a statement that children were not going to be of any value, he was, however, tied to the worldview. He was tied to a worldview that has already come to that decision. The worldview that children are a resource. You know, I was Minister of Education for part of my political career here in South Australia. I think I was quite a good one, but who knows, I'm not the person to ask. But what... Oh, I've got... thank you. Where were you when I needed you in '93? But, sorry, no, I didn't mean it. But I said something which I'm ashamed that I ever said. Unfortunately, it's on tape, and I'm trying to buy back all the tape so I can destroy them. But I said, children are our greatest resource. And I actually think that it was in the rule book that when you became a Minister of Education, they give you a little how-to manual, you know, Minister of Education for Dummies. And you turn to the first page, and one of the things it says is, say children are our greatest resource. Why? Because every education minister has ever said that. Why do I feel ashamed of having said that? Because, like this church leader, I was essentially saying something that was an abomination. I was essentially saying something that said children are worthwhile if they're worth something to me, to my society, to us in general. But that's not true. They do not have a dependency value. They have a preciousness value, an inherency value. An inherency value that says they are worth something because God created them. And to say they're a resource is to reduce them to a commodity. And there are indeed people in our world for whom children are a great resource. They appear on their balance sheet as an asset. And we know who such people are in this world. So, but that is a utilitarian perspective. The other danger of that perspective, by the way, is this. Not all children will be useful. I can think of a great many children who will be useful in our community, but there will be some for whom society has no use. And they become the street children. They become the throwaways. They become the detritus of a utilitarian worldview. So we have to decide, do we tie our context of the way we see mission with that utilitarian perspective, which is, by the way, a very satisfying one, because it makes sense when you don't think about the street kids being thrown away. If you put that out of your mind, for the rest of it, it makes enormous sense. It's the allocation of resources very successfully, very logically. But of course, it contains the trap of the great deceiver. You know, we actually see it happening in the Bible when Judas quibbles about the fact that ointment is being used, precious ointment is being used on Jesus. Well, why doesn't that get sold and help the poor? That is essentially a very utilitarian viewpoint. But the second issue here that comes into play in terms of loving our neighbour as ourselves is how we love our neighbour as ourselves. The Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Zizek makes the comment that in the context of the post-Holocaust era, in the context of multiple genocides in the 20th century, in the context of all sorts of other devastations of community in our world, the concept of neighbour has lost its innocence. And in a sense he goes on to argue that we have adopted neighbour in a relational value proposition way rather than in a preciousness way. And so that brings in the question of mutuality. When Jesus was talking about love your neighbour as yourselves, he wasn't making a proposition, love your neighbour, because it's going to make good sense, by the way, to do that. You know, entente cordiales are much better for the way the world operates than not to have that. It's just going to be messy if you don't do that. He made a much more fundamental proposition than that and said we should love them as ourselves. Why? Because he built into that question not a dependency relationship, but a preciousness relationship of the equalities of individuals. Mutuality, reciprocity. Now, in terms of how we deal with that in the mission context, this becomes fundamentally important. if we look at a quote from Jayakuma Christian, I'm not sure if you know his work. He is the head of World Vision India, and he wrote God of the Empty-Handed, which is a very powerful book. He makes the comment, when mutuality is lost, we tend to look for ponderous factors to explain major problems, or may I say, cheap ones. Now, I just want to go to an episode in my time in World Vision. It was an episode when I was visiting West Timor, rather. I was visiting Kupang. World Vision is a very hard-working organisation, and they work you hard. And so when you go visiting the field, you start at 7 o'clock every morning and you work right through into the evening, and the next morning you're back up again and you do the same again, visiting projects around the place. And I've been visiting these projects in Kupang, in West Timor, in some villages outside. And at the end of my third day, I knew I had one more community to visit. I was tired. I was hot. I was dirty. I was just ready to finish the visit. I'd had a lot of interesting times. I'd met a lot of interesting people. I'd seen a lot of great work. But I was about spent. But one more village to come. In this village, World Vision had done quite a number of things. It had helped to build an agricultural project. It had helped build an education project. It had helped build a health clinic. It had helped build a bridge to across a river so that people could get their goods to market. It had helped do things like that. And I meet the elders of the village. I'm tired, I want to go home, so my mind goes into automatic pilot. And in automatic pilot, what you do, you go to default mode. You have things that you can do while you're not really thinking, while you're not really there. And my default mode was to say, what do you think World Vision has most done to help you in the last 2 years that they've been here? And I expected him to say, oh, well, the school, or the health clinic, or the agricultural project, or something like that, whatever meant the most to him or his family or those who he had heard from the village about. Now, we get the question and answer over with, and then we'd go on to another question, and then I'd be able to get out of here quite soon. In fact, he did not answer any of that. He answered, what World Vision has done most for us is to help us understand how we can help ourselves. And in one instant, I felt profoundly ashamed. Because here was somebody who lived dawn to dusk and from dusk to dawn in this community year after year after year on much less resources than I have in my life, who had worked very hard and will continue to work very hard. He was not tired. He was not worn out. He was not wanting to go back and have a shower. He answered my question at face value. He took it to be an honest question. I was ashamed because it wasn't. Immediately what happened then was I re-engaged and became so engaged that I stayed for another 2 hours in that community and just totally forgot about my exhaustion, but I've never forgotten about my shame. And I tell you the story because essentially I failed the mutuality reciprocity test. I failed on that occasion to realize this was not about me. This was not about World Vision. This was not about the donors who had given money to World Vision to help that project. This was about an engagement of people with each other in their community and the privilege that we had to be allowed to be engaged with them. Now, this whole context of the ponderous factors that we face in life that often seems difficult. You know, we can make some nice, sweet statements about mutuality. Let's be kind to one another. Let's love one another. But when you're in the mission context, you don't have the easy option of that. Mark Leverton, in his book, The Dangerous Act of Worship, Living God's Call to Justice, he makes a statement that very often we in the church offer little more than comfort food, the baked potatoes of love, the melting butter of grace, with just enough bacon and chives of outreach to ease the conscience. All this becomes a churchly anaesthetic. Now, if what we've done when we've seen contexts in the mission context that challenge us enormously, and we come up with that kind of cheap theology, we have again failed the mutuality reciprocity test.